So really happy to have you here. Thank you for coming for our session. Yesterday was largely about the Africa Sandboxes Outlook. But today I'll touch a little bit into Sandboxes for AI, which is also a new report that we have launched that has some things that I feel like would be good for this audience that is specifically interested in sandboxes. The fact that you're here, I believe that you're interested in sandboxes. So this is our short overview. And I want to start by sharing this, which probably most of you have seen, or maybe some have not. But the dilemma in data governance usually comes to finding what we like to call a Goldilocks zone, where you're balancing, if there is such a thing even to balance, between restrictions, or rather not having too many restrictions, but then also making sure that you're not being too open, that you're not protecting data that is going to be used in any of the innovations. So the opportunities really lie in the middle, but I have to say that what works for one organization might not work for another, so there has to be some distinctiveness. There's no one sort of solution fits all when it comes to this data governance a challenge. But one thing that we have noticed of the DataSphere initiative through research, like I mentioned yesterday, that sandboxes is one of the areas that we have tried to really look into how do they work, how can they support regulatory innovation, is we know that they provide a controlled environment where experimentation can happen, but at a low risk kind of stage. It's not, solutions are not being rolled out to the general public, which can actually be harmful. So sandboxes provide an approach to being in the middle, not too few, not too many restrictions, but then also not too few protections. Then they also are a means to building and maintaining trust through multi-stakeholder interactions. So one thing that I will touch on is from the analysis we did of sandboxes in Africa, we noticed that regulators, particular regulatory organization has put up a sandbox, but it's really between them and the innovators, the people trying to, or solution providers, the people trying to test their solutions against regulatory frameworks, right? But then there's less engagement, like we had in today's panels and discussions with other stakeholders, civil society, academia, and yet with a sandbox, once these different stakeholder groups are invited into the discussions from the very start, it's a good place for building and maintaining trust. Why? Because you get every stakeholder to understand what happens. If it's a particular regulatory organization X that is dealing with data protection, do civil society organizations understand what such as a sandbox is going to look at? And I must mention, actually, we are really happy to note that we have a few personal data protection offices in Africa that are interested in piloting with sandboxes. Too early for me to disclose what's happening, but it's a step to show that we're going past just using sandboxes in fintech to other sectors as well. And then the issue with always putting text on the slide, I'm sure you've read through all of it, so I wonder if I should continue or even just go to the next one. But yes, so they help with legal and regulatory certainty, because then you're able to test your regulation. And what I can say at this point, even with personal data protection officers, is they are looking at sandboxes to help them to understand their data protection laws and how innovators can interact with them. Because sometimes it's one thing to have the law, but then how do innovators understand it? And without creating such a space, we know that from what we had yesterday, innovators tend to want to avoid regulators. So you don't even know, are they avoiding because they don't understand? Are they avoiding because they actually just hate regulation? So sandboxes are a good place for that. And then, of course, they bring about greater public understanding. But of course, if there is engagement and communication that has been planned for throughout the life cycle of a sandbox, which was one of the recommendations that we give in our report, that beyond just doing a sandbox and testing and internally learning as an organization, are you creating sensitization? Because one of the challenges we found is innovators sometimes don't even understand what to expect in a sandbox. So it's on the regulators to sort of create this awareness. So this sort of gives us like a background of why sandboxes can help with a challenge that we started with. And of course, yesterday I defined what sandboxes are, and good enough, our report is now online. But even this report about sandboxes for data that we published a while back, I don't remember the year, really has a lot to do with sandboxes. If from here you work for an organization that really would want to delve into sandboxes, this is also a good, nice start to complement the recent research that we have done. So why do a sandbox? Okay, at this point I think most of you already know why, but this, now what I'm sharing is what is detailed in our AI report. It is, for regulators, it helps to speed the speed of change. As we had yesterday, and we know, really, technology is advancing at a stage that regulation is not catching up, okay? Not, I feel like I'm obstructing the people on this side, but I was, right? You could have said. So sorry. Yes, so it helps to speed up change. Then it helps with collaboration. Sometimes if there is no framework to bring on different stakeholders, like I said, then it doesn't help. Then it also helps with being responsive and to work in an agile way. Again, technology is advancing, so if regulators don't catch up, you know. Then for private sector, so what we have done here, and this is detailed in the AI report, is for each stakeholder, what is the importance of sandboxes? And maybe I may not get into reading every one of them, but you can see, and we'll share these slides with those who are interested. You realize that sandboxes are useful for each of these stakeholders, and even more, okay? Now, when do you do a sandbox? Sometimes you might be tempted to think sandboxes work when you already have a regulation and you're testing against that regulation. But it's actually not the case. You can actually use sandboxes before regulation. And that's where you're going to use a sandbox to identify the gaps that need to be addressed with, let's say, a new regulation or a regulation adjustment, you know, something like that. And then during regulation development, so you're already in the process of developing a sandbox, but you need to understand, get insights from different stakeholders, from different solution providers. You also create a sandbox so that you're building the regulation as you're testing. Provides literally a real-time kind of setup. And then when you already have a regulation and you want to test compliance, understanding of this regulation by the stakeholders. Okay, so, and then of course, the note down is really saying that for private sector, sandboxes can be initiated to test AI applications. So this is not only for regulators, can also be used by these different stakeholders. So how do we sandbox? So at the DataSphere Initiative, we have come up with a methodology. And yesterday I talked about doing a comprehensive kind of approach to sandboxing, where you don't stop at sandbox planning and execution, but you also plan for communication and engagement, but also closure and evaluation. So what we're doing in our coaching journey, which is one of the activities that we're doing in the new phase of the Africa Sandboxes Forum, is we are working with stakeholders who are ready to set up sandboxes, to go through this journey, so that we do with you the initiation. The initiation is to help you to even know, is a sandbox what you need? Because sandboxes can be expensive, they can be time consuming. So sometimes you need to be sure a sandbox is actually what you need. And that's what we do in the first stages, where we craft questions that are going to make you think about the challenge that you have and decide, is a sandbox what I need? And then now once we have established, yes, it's a sandbox, then we get into planning for the sandbox. What are the resources that are needed? What are the teams that are needed? Because you don't want to get into a sandbox, as we found out from some of the people we interviewed for the report, as you'll find in the case studies, that you reached and started a sandbox and you're taking longer than you had planned for. Why? Because probably the regulators do not have the technical capacity to do the technical due diligence of the solutions, or that you've not thought about if the solution providers have understand what to expect in a sandbox. So you're taking part of the time to sort of prepare them to get into a sandbox, something that should have been done before. So again, this is a methodology that we are looking at. We're also looking in Africa for opportunities to sort of pilot and not necessarily pilot, actually. We're simulating sandboxes in different sectors, health, AI, with different stakeholders to see how would a regional sandbox, for example, in health in Africa look like. And on that, we're going to be hosting, potentially going to be hosting a lab, a sandboxing lab during, around the Africa AI Summit that is going to happen in Kigali on the 2nd and I think it's 3rd and 4th of April. So if any of you is going to be there, please be sure to look out for that and register for that lab, where we'll have different stakeholders, and ideally we want to take a day to go through each of these stages, looking at one case, either health or AI or both, depending on the interest that we will get. Okay, so I think that's mostly it. I won't get much into what is in these reports, but the methodology I just took you through of how, when, and why is in this in the AI report for AI sandboxes, and then the different things about, say, if you want to know the context of policy making in Africa and how sandboxes can help, is what we have covered largely in this report. But also, the interesting part is there are case studies, Africa case studies of people sandboxing, sharing their lessons, sharing their findings, sharing, everything that you would find interesting from someone who has actually participated if you're thinking of doing a sandbox. So I hope that's the end. I've already talked about the April sandboxing for AI and AI and health co-creation lab in April, but if also someone who might benefit from, for example, what we have talked about in this workshop, yesterday the launch, and today we're going to be having an online webinar in March. We'll share all that in our social media, but also something we are going to do this year that we're excited about is a sandbox summer school, which is scheduled for June, those dates anyway. And we're looking for people who are ready and interested in sandboxing. It might not be you in the room, but you might know someone who is actually ready and would like to participate in this summer school. We'll be conducting that. And then there's also another event. We realized that for Africa Sandboxes Forum, but also for the Global Sandboxes Forum, we need to do a lot more of knowledge sharing to get to a point where these tools are used. Okay, I hope that's the last one, so I can hand back to Rispa. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. A hand of applause for Maureen. From her presentation, what do you think sandboxes are? It's not a rhetorical question. Anyone can take it. Okay. Yes, please.
I think a sandbox is like a controlled environment where you can experiment on either regulatory or technical issues to do with data governance, but I think also with other concepts.
From your organization you're in, do you think it would be relevant for you, just based on your basic understanding at the moment? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay. One more question for you as we get into the next bit of our session today, where we're going to put together a small panel to just be able to exposit a bit more on how the sandboxing model helps with the innovating responsibly, and hopefully then see how different sectors or different organizations are tapping into this particular model. To take us through that, we have Maureen, who we have already met, the Africa Sandboxes Forum lead. We're also going to be joined by Diana Sang, who is the Africa Director at the Digital Impact Alliance, DAO. She's going to be our moderator today. You're welcome, Diana. We also have Karen Bett, who's the Senior Policy Manager for Data Equity and Inclusion at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. You're welcome, Karen. And then we have Dr. Japheth Odhiambo, who is the Deputy Director of Research and Innovation at the Communications Authority of Kenya. So I will invite them to join me here. Let me just set this up for them.
That's good.
And allow me to just simply read out from, I take it all the way back. Coming up first is data, as being seen to be most beneficial, benefiting from sandboxes. Then it's being followed by AI, being followed by health, finance, climate, and other. Okay? So let me allow Diana to take it away for now and get a few engagements, and then we can open it up for an open discussion from all of us. You're welcome.
Thank you, Rista. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you so much to Maureen for setting the stage for us. I feel like we're at a better... Odhiambo, you know that I'm going to start with you first from that perspective. So looking at the regulatory side, it plays a critical role in setting up and overseeing sandboxes. In your experience, what challenges do regulators face when designing and managing sandboxes, and how can we enhance regulatory agility when it comes to sandboxing?
Thank you. Good morning. Historically, regulation has evolved towards regulation. Realize in the very old days of wired communication, landline, and all that. So much was about command and control. We give you conditions, you don't comply, we enforce against you. And it has mutated over time in that model until within the information and communication space. The conversation now is in the fifth generation of regulation, which is called collaborative regulation. The flip side of collaborative regulation is collaborative regulation. So for the regulator, you are regulating collaboratively, but for the innovator, it is collaborative regulation in terms of interfacing with regulation. So it means therefore that the mindset generally has to change. When you read collaborative regulation, you cannot maintain the mindset of the stakeholder as a regulator. So over time, that has evolved. So you should see the sandbox as more of a regulatory sandbox, as more of a handshake between the regulator and the innovator. So they converge at a measurement. So to respond to the question, then what challenges have we seen in setting up and overseeing the sandbox? So based on that history, sometimes we do the infrastructure, we put together and get the sandbox to the communications authority to help us basically deal with the sector issue, taking into account the developments around the data ecosystem, because we are no longer around the landlines and calls, and it's about data. So the data ecosystem, the complications with the data ecosystem, the bloodlines that exist there, basically necessitate some fairly collaborative approach in looking at it. So we put together a sandbox. We started in 2018. To long story short, 2023 we put together a framework. Then we got into operationalizing that framework. So where we are now, we've largely operationalized it, and the current status is that we've admitted some players into the sandbox who are rolling out for testing. Challenges that we've seen. One, scoping. What is the scope of the sandbox? And scoping is important. It would be tied to the legal framework. Because for a regulator, remember sandboxes developed mainly from the fintech financial services side. So other people are now trying to take it up within the other spaces, but it's a big thing within the fintech side. So for us, even that we are dealing with information and communications, defining that scope has been one of the heaviest tasks we've had to deal with, and we are still dealing with it because you get the feeling at times that people want to believe that the regulatory sandbox that you run is a sandbox for anything and everything. So you can bring a digital innovation in agriculture, you hope into the sandbox. Then how do you deal with it? Bring something from the fisheries and all that. Yet that may not necessarily be the case, because at the end of the day, the regulatory sandbox is supposed to help us with one, while we try to promote innovation, we are also trying to grow regulation, so that regulation does not do a lot of pacing behind innovation. So that's basically one of the problems. The second issue that we have seen over time is the question of skilling and capacity. And basically, it's about, in our space, we realized over time we have the skills, we have the capacity, but you also notice that you cannot have everything. And that would bring in the question of how do you collaborate around that space so that you have all the skills that you probably need to deal with the sandboxing journey. That has been a challenge for us. Another challenge, and I think it arose in Maureen's screen, is the question around communication. Because a sandbox is as good as people know about it. It's as good as people appreciating what it does and what it can easily take care of and what it can't. Look at it like a playground. So in the playground you have several stakeholders, and you basically have to keep the stakeholders in constant communication. One of the other challenges we've seen is given the evolution of the mindset from command and control regulation to collaborating regulation, you realize that we are still struggling with the lagging question of we want to hang on to the traditional regulation as we know it. We want to import that mindset into the sandboxing space. But over time, we realized that awareness, creation, and all those things are very useful towards living out. When we started, one of the challenges we noticed was how do we interface with the potential applicants? How do we journey with potential players? So one of the things we then did was recognize the need for a platform. So we've been building a platform that we use to handle communication in terms of applications. What we've done with that space as well is within that platform, because we noticed there is room for co-regulation with other regulators, we are providing space for basically a sandbox environment, where sandboxes, various sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes can come to play and collaborate. You have the Capital Markets Authority with their sandbox, you have the Insurance Regulatory Authority with their sandbox, but you also have innovations within the space of the Central Bank of Kenya. They don't have a sandbox necessarily, but digital innovations in that space basically spill over into these other sectors. So we are trying to build that environment under what we call the Innovation Acceleration Centers program. So those are some of the things that we are looking at. Regulatory agility, one of the challenges we noticed as well is when setting up a sandbox, one of the things we have to be careful about is where do you found the legal basis? What is the foundation, the legal foundation for that sandbox? Within the Kenya Information and Communications Act, for example, you may not necessarily find a very specific provision saying we will process some applications through a sandbox, or it does not necessarily provide for that. But when you interpret the meaning of regulation broad enough to include now regulation for the future, you realize then you develop some legal basis for it. In some other spaces, they're more specific. What we are trying to do is to address that by amending the law to basically provide for it, considering that now we have stabilized enough, and we are on the move. So look at the sandbox like you'd look at, how many of you are familiar with the clinical trials in medicine? Yes. So look at the sandbox. Sandboxes were largely modeled around the idea, not necessarily identical, but the idea of clinical trials and the regulation of clinical trials. So regulatory sandboxes are supposed to help with that. We'll probably clarify more as we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odhiambo. I was taking a lot of notes. I think we need some more time with you. That's really good background. And I think when you were describing that the Capital Markets Authority have a sandbox, CA has a sandbox, the central bank doesn't have a sandbox yet. I think a question that came to my mind and we can cover later is, do we need so many, like, does everybody need to set up a sandbox, or could we have like a central sandbox and then maybe housed at CA and then different entities can come and use it, looking at it from a cost perspective? Maybe you could answer it in a minute and then we'll go to the next question.
I do not necessarily think that, considering that regulation is something that is very specific to the law tells you that you are a regulator and this is what you regulate. So it would be very difficult to have like a centralized converged sandbox. But we've realized over time that having sandboxes scattered all over the place without providing for collaborative frameworks around the sandboxes is a big problem. So what we are doing with that, we are trying to put together what, under the Acceleration Centers program, the policy experimentation objective, we are putting together a sandbox environment that can onboard the many sandboxes that are strewn all over the place. We realize that there are so many of them. Some are coming up. It's also an environment that is to help us support the ecosystem, whoever wants to develop a sandbox and all that. So I think an environment, creating an environment where they can converge. In the UK, for example, it's easier for them to converge because they have a regulators forum, for example, where they can discuss some of these cross-cutting issues. If we have such an environment like that, a platform like that, then we can easily, if something comes to CA and it belongs to the central bank or it belongs to the CMA, we can easily channel it out. And that is one of the things that our platform is trying to also do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. With that backdrop that Dr. Odhiambo has said, maybe let's look at it now from the industry and business perspective. And Maureen, I'm going to turn to you now, just to understand businesses and especially private sector, they see Sandbox as valuable for testing new ideas, but there's still a lot of barriers to participation. I don't know if the very limited presence of private sector in this room today is also a sign of the limited participation on the private sector side. But I'd like to learn from you, like, what are some of the key barriers that you've seen businesses or solution providers face when participating in or considering to participate in sandboxing activities, and maybe what improvements could you suggest?
Thank you for that question, Diana. So I will speak from having interacted with just a few people that have interacted in sandboxes when we're doing case studies. The first one is actually what has been talked about throughout the workshop, sensitization. They don't know what to expect in the sandbox. So usually, even when the sandbox is out there, depending on how much sensitization and publicity has been done about the sandbox, then some solutions out there, they don't know that they actually need to, they could benefit from a sandbox. So even not knowing about the sandbox, but also what to expect in the sandbox. But I mean, we have to appreciate that it's also a new concept, especially when it comes to these other sectors, not necessarily fintech. So that's why, for example, from the case studies that I shared yesterday, you'd find that EcoBank has tested up to 109 solutions, but some of the government set up sandboxes have tested a few because the environments are different, and so we have to give that room for growth. So yes, not knowing, which of course is an idea of doing more research and development in this area, sensitizing more of the public about this, and then co-creating, like the DataSphere initiative is trying to do. The other thing that came up in one of the cases, this was, I think, South Africa's Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group, Sandbox. For them, they felt like this was one solution provider who was in the sandbox, and what they said is they felt like regulators were not ready for them. They came in the sandbox to experiment, but they felt like regulators were slow in getting them to like test us. Are we compliant? Can we move on? Which again also we might come to the idea of if this was the first pilot of the sandbox based on the report that was published by the IFWG, it was the first case. So it makes sense that, of course, regulators were slow. They're trying this for the first time. So I feel like some of the challenges that are there in the ecosystem right now are going to be overcome with time. And when it comes to the interest, solution providers actually interested in sandboxes. In fact, I think a few weeks back we had an engagement with health sector solution providers. And one thing that we learned from, because we were trying to find if we were to set up a health sandbox, say for Africa as a region, what is the pressing challenge that solution providers are facing? And they were saying, we have solutions which are ready to be deployed. And if there was an environment where we can bring this solution before regulators and they look at it and they're able to sort of give a certification of this solution looks safe to be tested in different countries, for us that would help us because governments or ministries are not really adopting their solutions. So the interest is there, but the challenge that solution providers especially are having is knowing where the sandboxes are, which sandboxes to participate in, while the regulators are also dealing with the issue of, hey, we need to set up all the systems, we need to do the technical due diligence for some of these new solutions, because as we know them, they're new and we are all trying to understand them. I think that answers your question.
Thank you so much. And maybe just one follow-up. The lack of awareness that you've mentioned is one of the biggest challenges in businesses and solution providers participating in sandboxing. I think just ties in to what Dr. Odhiambo was saying, that a sandbox is as good as the number of people who are aware about it and who are using it. So I think already we are seeing opportunities for improvement. But now so beyond individual participation by maybe specific solution providers or businesses, do you think there's a role that the private sector as an industry could play in promoting the use of or supporting the practice of sandboxing in Africa? Just looking at, especially since a lot of the digital infrastructure in Africa, over 80% is coming from private sector investment. So do you think as an industry they could play a bigger role?
I believe so, and I actually tried to get someone who has participated in the EcoBank Sandbox for this session on the panel, but I wasn't able to, because I really wanted us to pick from them what are some of the lessons we can learn from you, having done, because I think they have done up to like 15 iterations of the same sandbox. I feel like, first of all, we can pick so much lessons from some of these private sector companies that have been running sandboxes over and over again, because that shows that it's useful, it's working for them. So what can the public sector learn from them? So yes, the role is there, especially for those which already understand, to sort of be able to share lessons. But then the other role that I feel like can also be played by private sector is if we think about, say, the big tech companies. If, for example, we would have the likes of, say, Facebook or Google participating in a local sandbox in Kenya, it would be such a great thing for different other countries to learn from that, because they are bringing solutions here. So for us to be able to have such a case tested in a national country, I feel like that would also help, because it would expose a bigger magnitude of what can be done in terms of technology solutions. knowing at the level at which they are innovating and at the level at which the local organizations are innovating. Now, I'm not saying that regulators might be ready to regulate, such big companies. Maybe we are not, but it's something that maybe we should start looking into. What if there was a requirement that for a solution by Google to be used in Kenya, it has to be tested in our sandbox? Maybe that would be helpful. Are we there? Maybe not. Now, the issue usually comes that such big companies, of course, have enough they have enough lawyers to sort of cover their issues. For them to entice them to be in such a sandbox would be a whole different approach to say when you're enticing an innovator in Kenya who wants to launch their product for the Kenyans. So that's a space that I feel like regulators can play a role by thinking about how can we incentivize these big tech companies who we know are the ones influencing even the local tech companies. Because usually you'll find a local solution is built on an API that has been built by Google. So if, for example, we've tested that API at that level, then it would be easier maybe to actually evaluate the effectiveness or, the level of responsibility for local solutions. So I feel like that's where private sector can play a role. Are we able to be there in a few years? I can't answer that, but I really wish we'd get to that point.
Fantastic. Shows the power of collaboration. It shows another angle that collaboration can take beyond actually just designing solutions. Is also just the learning that can happen. Can we get all these players who are making good business out of the continent and in the country, can they also support from the regulatory perspective and learnings? And maybe Dr. Diambo will, part of the policy experimentation project you mentioned, if I got it correctly, maybe in the future we'll see the Googles and the Metas as part of your sandbox. Should we give you a minute to respond to that?
Yeah, we hope so. We hope so. It's a learning process. But as Maureen was talking about those big tech, we have an interesting case. We still under review. I think you know about the WorldCoin. One of the things that is happening there is that some jurisdictions are waiting to see what we are doing with them. They want to get into the sandbox. We still having to really review a lot of issues. So people are actually waiting. Another point, I think, for the private sector, you realize when innovators approach the regulatory sandbox, for example, one of the first expectations for them, especially the ones who don't know much about the sandbox, is funding. I'm thinking the sandbox could provide a good platform for visibility for these innovators so that the private sector can see them. The fact that you are working with the government regulator, that journey is something that should give some innovators and investors confidence in what you're trying to do. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we've heard about the government and regulation perspective, the industry and private sector perspective. Karen, we'd love to turn to you now and hear more about on the policy and innovation side. We've seen sandboxes being used in different sectors, and their comparison with clinical trials was also very useful, just understanding how sandboxes operate. But looking specifically in these innovative sectors, for instance, AI, how are sandboxes shaping innovation in these different sectors?
Thanks. Thanks, Dana. I'll start with a story where I first had sandboxes. And it was 2019, and we were having a meeting between the regulators and mobile network operators talking about how do you unlock mobile phone data for measuring the SDGs. And the person who actually talked about sandboxes was then the central bank deputy governor, of course coming from the fintech space. But I think, of course, over time that has evolved significantly. I feel there's definitely the promise of sandboxes in the continent. I see it from how it is shaping and how it can shape if we sort of fix a few things or address a few issues. I think the thing I like with the continent of Africa is it's sort of a hotbed of many things. Of course, we have regulators who are very progressive and wanting to, evolve the regulatory space. We have the people who need the solutions, whether it's in health, agriculture, and education and others. We have the private sector who are making money, making business in the continent, and therefore the continent is a really good space to sandbox and sandbox it well. I don't think you'll get it in other continents. I think where I'm seeing, where I'm seeing the sectors that is sandboxing is helping a lot, of course, as mentioned by Maureen, is AI health. I've also seen some really good work in assistive technology, technology that is helping people who have visual impairments, hearing impairments, and those are real examples because people need those solutions to function. And I think in that space is where you're sort of seeing technology and innovation really working. And I know there are those assistive technology labs, for example, which is trying to, I don't know if they call it sandbox, but it's the space to really test out those innovations, test it with real people, and put it out there in the market. I think the other way, as I finish, just how sandboxes can shape the work we're doing at the continent is really going back to the main ingredient that spurs innovation, and it's data. So if we don't have the right data, if we don't have access to that data, then innovation is sort of ahead or not solving real people's solutions. But of course, data in the continent is not always accessible, available, consistent, and the likes. And it takes me back to the story that I started with, that if we unlock this data from the private sector, I feel that it can actually help us further innovate. And that in and of itself is a sandbox, because you can't just unlock privately held data and use it for public good. There's regulation and there's thinking about what needs to happen for that to take place. So it's sort of going back to how do we sandbox regulating sharing data as one experiment in and of itself. But yeah, I think definitely the continent is promising in terms of having the gold standard of sandboxes.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think we've spoken a lot about sandboxing in a country perspective, but I think with the momentum that the AFCFTA is gaining and the big pushes for cross-border collaboration, cross-border data sharing, cross-border payments, I think there's going to be a need also for a cross-border lens to sandboxing. I don't know whether we are getting close to having like a cross-border sandbox maybe in the future, but I think to wrap us up today, Dr. Diambo, would like to see, do you see a role for cross-border regulatory collaboration when it comes to sandboxing?
Yes. I would give a practical example. We've interacted with it live. The regulators in the health sector are trying to model a sandbox for health tech. One of the things that they are indeed struggling with, and you see that from the initiative that is taking place at the Africa CDC. Africa CDC is trying to put together a sandbox. The difficulty they're having is that each country has its own way of doing things in terms of the law, regulations, policy. But the Africa CDC wants to put a continental sandbox around health-related innovations. So the question that arose in one of the discussions was, is that even possible? And the answer to that question was, it's only possible if the individual member states decide to cooperate and collaborate. So that if there's an innovation, for example, we can have, for example, a setup for mutual recognition. If, say, the Communications Authority of Kenya has processed an applicant here through the sandbox, then Uganda, through that collaboration, could easily recognize that. The same thing they do with each one of you has a phone. All those phones and this terminal equipment, they are type approved by the regulator. Ideally, every regulator should be having a lab to type approve equipment. But what you realize that we do a lot of mutual recognition, what is called type acceptance. So if a lab, say in Japan, that is accredited, does that, then it can be recognized in Kenya without necessarily going through a lab process again. So yes, cross-border engagement is going to be essential because technology, as it is evolving, does not necessarily recognize borders, especially when you look at the effects that they come with. So there has to be that. Thanks. Maybe to add now that I have the mic, I can talk the whole day. So maybe to add a little, the question around influencing policy, how sandboxes influence innovation. Practical example again, we have an applicant, Maureen interacted with him. We've learned a lot from that process, our first applicant into the sandbox. So what we do in this process is, ordinarily, there are aspects that would require components to be licensed or some authorization of sorts. The applicant is using frequency spectrum. Is using, of course, equipment that should be type approved. What the regulatory sandbox environment does is that it gives us room to give them some exemption as they test on real consumers. So for example, we waive the requirement for type approval during the testing phase. We equally authorize them to utilize certain frequency bands during the testing period without going through the rigorous licensing process, so that they can roll out tests on real consumers, and then as they test, we also learn for regulatory purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this session could have easily been a full day session, but we have to stop now. We'd like to give chance for maybe 2 or 3 questions, if we have any from the audience. We have one at the front. Any other question at the back? Okay. We have 2 questions.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'd like to thank the panel for such an enlightening session. In the interest of learning still, I'm curious about financing around the testing of innovations. How does that work for a regulatory sandbox, especially in a case where there's no investor?
Hi, how are you? This is a question not to the panel, but basically to the participants of this session. And I was just wondering whether, especially for the developers, and with the social media platforms coming up every other day, do we think, or is there space for social media platforms to go through regulatory sandboxes because of the harm that they have been perceived to be creating in society? Do you think that it would be a requirement that is achievable and actualizable for any platform that is coming into being to go through a sandbox?
And maybe just finally, I really liked what Karen talked about, the different forms in which sandboxes seem to be taking, and not necessarily being called sandboxes. So maybe we could think about, are there actual spaces all across us that are sandboxes, but because of, for lack of a better word, the elitist notion that sandboxes seems to present, we do not appreciate them as such. So that we are then able to, because if I go out there and nakata mboga,
Chopping vegetables.
and I start talking, I'm sharing my number to pay for that, you know, I'm exposing different aspects of myself. Can I begin to engage with this person around better ways of sharing my data, keeping my data, storing my data, without using the term sandbox? Is that something we could perceive so that it stops being a very high level concept, but that's something that's accessible to all of us? So that even as the regulators are now pitching for it and trying to approach innovators, the startups, particularly for example in Kenya, many startups will be like, why do I need to go into that, right? But if we're approaching them from a place where it seems something comprehensible, is this something that they'll then be able to buy into?
It's a great comment, Rispa, because we need to make it a culture. And are there things that we are already doing that even if it's meeting 80% or 70% of what an ideal sandbox could be, then we are 70% in that culture of testing within a controlled environment. So how do we make that? I think that's a great idea. Is the term sandbox the confusing factor here? I think that's a great perspective to have. I see you are handed the mic. Will you answer the financing question?
I can take the financing question. Again, I'll go to the real example that we have. The gentleman is, the innovation is supposed to help with offline delivery of content, and it can be used in several use cases. He's testing with educational content, basically to serve unserved and underserved populations. So one of the challenges that the journey we've worked with the innovator, initially he was coming in from the mindset of, I'm going to get financed out of, for example, the Universal Service Fund. But we had to sort of educate him a bit over time, slowly, that really it is not, funding opportunities may be available, but it is not direct. So one of the things that the Sandbox platform is supposed to help this gentleman with is, once we give you, because the admission letter into the Sandbox basically telling you, you will test, these are the parameters of testing, these are the exemptions, the resources you have access to in terms of regulatory resources, frequency spectrum, use of type approval equipment without necessarily requiring type approval. So what we've noticed is that he is using it to pitch to investors. And the line is supposed to be drawn, and that is where I think I link it to what you're saying. Calling it a sandbox, I think at the end, when they were trying to come up with this sandbox idea, they were also trying to distinguish the sandboxes from other like concepts. You have incubators, you have hubs, you have test beds, all those. So I think the arrival at the name sandbox may have been, of course, meant to distinguish. But I agree, I think there should be a handshake, and that's why a proper platform that brings together so many people would be useful, because the regulatory sandbox is basically supposed to test against regulation. So no funding. But if you are given visibility within that platform, if we have such platforms, such fora, and we can bring this guy along to speak and pitch, you know, it's getting exposed to potential investors, which he may not have had an opportunity to interact with. So I think it's more of an interactive space that has to bring in collaboration, a lot of it. Yeah.
Yes, Aaron.
To build on that point, and it's good to see you after so many years. I think financing, what I think about innovation is sometimes we innovate to make money, but sometimes, well, we need to innovate to solve real problems. And I think if we don't have that financing incentives or the money-making incentives, that's where you start on a clean slate. I think who pays and who gains should be helping us to unpack that financing, who pays and who's gaining the most. If it's this innovator, then there should be a model where they pay, even if it's once the solution has scaled or gone into market, then there's a way that they pay back. I think government should also have it in their budgets or in their annual plans, just the financial contributions to spur that innovation. And then, of course, the private sector as well, contributing to that, and then thinking of a cost recovery way. As you can see, I'm sort of creating a model here in my head that needs to just further unpack. I think the other thing, and as Daktari was mentioning, funding can be many ways. It can be money, it's the skills, it's the time, and it's the opportunities. So it's sort of really unpacking what does financing for a sandbox look like, and then even try to cost that. You'll find that the skills and opportunities must be costing much more than the money that actually goes into it.
Fantastic. There was a question posed to the audience about social media. Do we have somebody who could answer? Yes?
Thank you. You'll bear with my voice. I'm about to assault you with it because I have a really horrible flu. So to answer, I'll attempt to answer the question and frame it in a way in such that we've already been explained to what regulatory sandboxes are, or just sandboxes are generally. And they tend to operate in a controlled environment. Now, if you look at how social media platforms have evolved or morphed over time, you'll notice that they're very erratic and they operate in a very uncontrolled environment. So I think sandboxes would be amazing for social media platforms in terms of locking down things like data protection regulations or consumer-centric regulations. But then there might be a limitation whereby, if you take the example of Instagram, for example, when it first began, it was only pictures. Then it evolved to videos. Then now it evolved to a place whereby we can now make money and do campaigns, and we now have social media influencers and people actually having jobs out of these things. This is not something that ideally somebody would have anticipated in a sandbox. Maybe they would have, maybe they would not have. And also, as you've seen, the existence of social media platforms has also evolved through the evolution of laws. So many laws have been built upon existing social media platforms. Sometimes the way they evolved is a little bit unpredictable, and seeing that sandboxes are a confined environment whereby you're sort of dealing with something that is likely to be predictable, it might be a half and half, where it might work to an extent and then fail to just cover the other unpredictable elements of it.
Thank you very much. I think it's time for lunch, so I won't hold you any longer. Thank you so much to the incredible panelists. This was a fantastic discussion. Thank you to the audience as well. I think what I take away from this is really looking at Sandbox. I love the example Dr. has mentioned twice. Sandbox is a handshake. I think it's good that it's giving Kenyans a different connotation to handshakes. But I think we need to change how we view them, and then we need to make it, people need to be aware of it, what the benefits are, how to approach it. If I have a solution, how do I get to CA, for example? What types of solutions are suitable for the sandbox environment? What is the threshold to get there? So I think it's fantastic that this is happening, and we look forward to the next steps. And congratulations to DataSphere for the fantastic report. We look forward to hearing more from you guys around sandboxing. Thank you very much.